Now, one of the techniques the classical economists use to show the flaws with the mercantilist approach was to get people to realize that it's not a bad thing to get something more cheaply from foreigners than you can produce yourself. And so Adam Smith has a lot of famous passages in The Wealth of Nations driving home this point to say, look, at the person running a household, if he can buy something in the marketplace more cheaply than it would cost him to produce internally, so if it's someone who has a farm, let's say, and he could raise chickens himself if he wanted to, but if it's just cheaper to buy the eggs from the marketplace and get his eggs that way, well, then it's not a mark of folly, but actually it's good management, it's prudence to buy from others what they sell you on better terms than what you could do yourself. Right? That's the whole point of trade in general, is that rather than you making everything yourself, you specialize, you focus on the stuff that you're really good at, and then you trade with others. You get other people to give you things that they can produce on better terms than you can do yourself. So before I drill down into the logic of that, let me first take a brief digression here to talk about what is arguably the most famous essay in all of economics, is Frederick Bastiat's so-called Petition of the Candle Makers. So it still reads very well to this day. You can Google it. It's all over the place on the internet. And it's just a model of great satire to show the way a sharp thinker can get the average person to see economic insights and to just have things click. And specifically the technique that Bastiat used, so his point is he wanted to ridicule mercantilist legislation, and in particular, he wanted to ridicule the arguments made by the people who were in favor of mercantilist policies. And so if you think through the logic of it, which groups in society are going to be the ones lobbying for what we today would call protectionist barriers? It's going to be the domestic manufacturers. Right? That if the government, let's say the government of France, has policies in place that encourage people in France to buy agricultural products produced by French farmers rather than importing agricultural products from abroad, well, who's going to be really in favor of those kind of policies? The French farmers. Now, how are they going to lobby? What arguments are they going to use? Well, they're not going to just say we want to be richer and have our consumers be poorer. That's not what they're going to say. They're going to say, oh, this provides jobs. This provides income for the national economy. This is great to promote industry and so on. Look at it, promotes sales and production. And it would really devastate us if you allowed all these cheap imports to come in and just ruin our own industry. Okay, and that should sound familiar to you. That's another benefit from reading Bastiat's essay, is to see that the arguments in favor of these protectionist policies were the same way back then as they are to this day. Okay, so how did Bastiat tackle that? He didn't just walk through the logic of, well, they say this, but that's wrong because of X, Y, and Z. He didn't do that. Instead, he did a satirical piece, the Petition of the Candle Makers. And what it was is he was pretending to be writing on behalf of the candle makers, the people in France who made candles, and he was writing to the French government and petitioning them saying, you need to pass regulations requiring people during the day to block out the sun, so that people who are indoors, they need to board up the windows or take the blinds down, what have you, to keep sunlight from getting into the room. Now that, of course, sounds absurd, but he walked through the logic of it, and he said, because how can we compete with something that can produce light so easily? It's not fair. The sun can produce light far more efficiently than we can with our little candles and all the effort it takes to make a candle. And then it was walking through the benefits of this proposal, saying, can you imagine how many people now being prohibited from using the sunlight during the day will have to turn to artificially produced light. In particular, they'll have to buy a lot more candles. And so look at how much our industry will grow. Our production will go way up, our revenues will go up, we'll have to hire more people. And so this is a good thing. All right, so, and he does a great job of just taking the logic of standard protectionist justifications and applying it to this proposal. So of course the point is it's a satire, it's a reductio ad absurdum. It's to show this logic has to be wrong, because look it, if you think it makes sense to put in restrictions to keep crops from England out in order to promote French agriculture, and the argument is, well, it's not fair because the English can, they have certain advantages, or to keep out sweaters made in England to promote French industry. If those are the arguments you use, and the reason you would need to keep them out, and you'd have to have the government favoring your people over the foreign producers, is there must be some advantage that the foreign producers have. Otherwise, there wouldn't even be an issue. And so if for some reason the foreign producers can sell more cheaply to your customers than your domestic producers can, they must have some advantage, and so the domestic producers say that's not fair. How can we compete with that? You need to level the playing field. And the benefits flowing from such a leveling would be our sales will go up. We'll provide more jobs for Frenchmen. Right? So Bastiat was just showing we could use that same mentality to make it a crime to let sunlight into your business or residence during the day. And that will certainly provide a stimulus to the candle makers and all of their employees and so on. So the benefit of that is not just to stop and say, okay, yeah, that's ridiculous, and move on, but just think through, well, wait a minute, what is wrong with it? All right, so hopefully everybody can grasp immediately that would be crazy, but then why is it crazy? Because that's really the point. Once you walk through and convince yourself specifically what is it that would be goofy about banning sunlight, then you see, and you see that those arguments also apply to the real world cases of protectionist policy. So specifically, notice we don't make ourselves richer by abstaining from the enjoyment of or from using the gifts provided by nature. We have this light coming to us for free. The sun is just giving us all this light during the daytime. And so we don't need to use our workers and other scarce resources to produce candles to produce light under those circumstances. No, we can just take the sunlight's free gift and then devote our workers and our wax and whatever you make the wick out of and so forth into other things so we can be richer. We already have the light given to us for free, so we don't need to waste our resources making more light. Instead, we can use our resources to make other stuff. So now during the daytime, we've got the light that the sun gave us for free, and we've got whatever other things we can make. But if instead we foolishly listened to the petition of the candle makers and we blocked out the sunlight, yes, the candle makers would expand their operations, more French workers would get sucked into that industry, and candle production would go up, but on net we would all be poorer, because that means those workers had to come from somewhere. The other resources going into the production of those candles had to come from somewhere. Not to mention, too, that the light provided by candles can't hold a candle to the light provided by the sun during the daytime. All right, so it's people would be objectively poorer in some aggregate sense. There would be less total production of stuff if you included the sunlight's free production. Okay, so that's the logic. And so once you see how it would be ridiculous in that one case, you should be able to generalize it and see, oh yeah, the standard mercantilist or protectionist arguments don't hold for other areas as well. It's just not as obvious in other areas as it is for something ridiculous like let's not let the sunlight come in. So that in general is a great model for how economists can educate the public and get them to see the problem with pernicious government policies, is to just boil it down to the essence, to give some crystal clear example where everybody can see the fallacy that's involved. Now, when it comes to the specific case for free trade that the British classical economists made, there was a two-pronged approach. Adam Smith used examples in his book that focused on what we would nowadays call absolute advantage. So Adam Smith had in mind that, well, gee, if the people in France can make champagne with fewer labor hours than the people in England, but the people in England can make sweaters with fewer labor hours than the people in France, well then clearly the French and the English both enjoy more stuff if the French have their workers concentrate on making champagne and the English have their workers concentrate on making sweaters, and then they just trade the surplus with each other. Okay, so you can come up with numerical examples. It's beyond the scope of this introductory class to get into that stuff, but if you want to Google, you can certainly find all kinds of examples online walking you through numerically if you want to see a specific quantitative example, just to show you that, so if your people don't want to just drink champagne, they also want to have sweaters, and the English also, they don't just want to have sweaters, they also want champagne. There's two different approaches technologically. One is you can have your people produce everything, that your people make all the sweaters and all the champagne that your people are going to enjoy, or you can focus on one, create more of that particular good than your people are going to use, and then ship the excess across the border in exchange for the surplus that the other people made. And so if you have a situation where there's absolute advantages between the two countries, well then it's obvious. And that's the kind of example that Adam Smith focused on. Now, David Ricardo came along, and he's historically credited with being the one who formalized and popularized an even subtler justification for the benefits of trade. And this is what was called comparative advantage. And so Ricardo showed, even if you had a hypothetical country where its workers were so productive that they were better at everything in terms of how many hours it would take them to produce each type of good. So even if their workers could produce more of those goods per hour than some other country, than their workers could do for any of those goods, it still would make sense for the superior country to focus on the area where it had a real advantage. And for the other country that we might call the inferior country, or the poorer country, the less productive one, they would focus on the thing where their disadvantage was the smallest. And again, you can run through numbers, and there's all kinds of examples on the internet if you want, showing the logic and the advantages and how both countries can be richer. So again, what you're going to see is the people in both countries end up consuming more total stuff than they did if they don't trade. Okay, so that's the logic. So again, just to walk you through that, Adam Smith tended to focus on examples involving an absolute advantage, where, let's say, the French could make more bottles of champagne per hour of French labor than the English could, but the English could make more sweaters per hour of English labor than the French could. And so under those circumstances, it's kind of a no-brainer. Yeah, you focus on the things that you're good at, and then trade the surplus, and then clearly both people in France and England get to consume more bottles of champagne and have more sweaters than would otherwise be possible. Okay, that's easy. What Ricardo did is he went even further, and he said, I'm just making these up, imagine that English workers with an hour of labor can produce more bottles of champagne and more sweaters. right? So maybe they can produce, maybe the English workers can do, with a certain quantity of labor, they can either do 10 bottles of champagne or 5 sweaters, but in France, with an hour of labor, they can only do, or a unit of labor, they can only do 1 bottle of champagne or 1 sweater. Okay, so you might think, well, under those exaggerated scenario conditions, why would the English benefit from trading with the French? The English should just focus and produce everything because there's so much more. But no, that doesn't work. That there, the English would focus on the area where they had the 10-to-1 advantage rather than the 5-to-1 advantage. And the French should specialize in the area where their disadvantage is only the 1-to-5. All right, so that's the logic of it. It's the same. If you want a numerical example and you're working with my textbook Lessons for the Young Economist, it's actually in a prior chapter where we walked through the logic of comparative advantage at the retail shopping mall level. And I just showed how the owner of a store, a clothing store in a mall, she has 2 tasks that she can engage in. One is to deal with the customers and try to make sales, and the other task is she has to tidy up the store at the end of the shift to get it ready for the next day. And she's thinking about hiring a teenage kid. Now, she's better at both tasks. She can tidy up the store more quickly than the kid can, and she can sell more stuff to customers per hour of her effort than the kid can. So you might think there's no gain to her from hiring him, but actually when we walk through the numbers, you see it makes sense for her to specialize in being on the floor dealing with customers, trying to get them to buy clothes, and have the teenager be the one to tidy up the store so she can deploy her labor most productively. It's the same logic as why would a pediatrician hire nurses and other assistants? Right, so technically the pediatrician, you can imagine he might be better at taking people's blood pressure and interviewing them and getting just a rough rundown of what their symptoms are. But in practice, when you go to a doctor's office, that's not what happens. Instead, you meet with several people, somebody weighs your kid and takes his blood pressure and asks, okay, what's going on? Does he feel nauseous? What's going on? Writes all that stuff. And then the head, the pediatrician comes in really quickly and goes. And so the idea is there that even if the pediatrician actually would be better, could take blood pressure more quickly or more accurately, what have you, it still makes sense for the pediatrician to focus on the areas where he or she has the comparative advantage. Okay, so it's that same logic that holds at the individual level, just generalized to national levels, and you see it with the context of international trade. So again, that's how David Ricardo sort of elaborated and extended Adam Smith's analysis to show why you want to, if what you're trying to do is promote the standard of living of your people, you actually make them wealthier in a very meaningful sense by allowing unfettered trade between the two countries. As I said, there's lots of ways to see the benefits of free trade and to see the problems with mercantilist or protectionist policies. And so let me, in this segment, just walk you through 2 examples. So one of them is devised by Henry George, and he pointed out, he said, there's a certain contradiction here in the popular attitudes toward appropriate government policy, that when there's peacetime, our government wants to erect barriers to foreign goods getting into our country. And it justifies these barriers by saying it will promote domestic employment, or it will create a favorable balance of trade, and we'll have net income flowing into our country. And that's the justification. So it will be a spur to domestic industry. And so the idea there is that it's good if the government artificially forces our people domestically to produce stuff that actually they could obtain on better terms from foreign producers. And yet Henry George says, notice though that when we're actually at war with another country, one of the standard things that we do to hurt them is we'll use our Navy to impose a blockade. So we will try to prevent other countries from sending goods into the country with which we're at war. And so he's pointing out, doesn't there seem to be a certain contradiction there? That, in effect, we're enacting super trade barriers on another country when we blockade them during a war. And so if mild trade barriers are good during peacetime that we impose on ourselves because it spurs domestic employment and industry, well then how come we're not doing a huge favor to our enemy during a wartime when we blockade them? Shouldn't that make their people all of a sudden get tons of employment? And shouldn't their domestic industries rise up and replace what was formerly being imported? But we can all see that, no, during a wartime, you hurt another country when you blockade them. All right, now, in fairness, you could go through and try to pick out specific problems with that, and you could say, well, maybe there's some commodity or something that they can't really produce domestically. But even there, okay, just go ahead and walk through the logic of it and figure out what you don't like about Henry George's idea, but then it starts to unravel the general case for protectionism. Right, that if you say, well, maybe there's some small island somewhere, well, let's update it to modern terms, or modern times, some small island somewhere and they don't have petroleum. They can't domestically produce crude oil at all, and so they're utterly dependent. They have cars and they have machines that run on gasoline and things like that, and they're utterly dependent on oil imports, or else their economy is going to come to a standstill. And so that's why imposing a blockade on them would be crippling, because they really can't domestically replace what was being imported. Well, okay, but then that's just a matter of degree, because technically they could replace it, right? They could have people just ride bicycles instead of driving automobiles. Bicycles don't take gasoline. There's never an all or nothing when it comes to economics. There's always various substitutes and things you can do. And so if you see the logic of that, well then by the same token, if it's just a modest trade barrier, like if you say, oh, well no, that means, so that's qualitatively different from like a country just saying we're going to put a steep tariff on foreign cars coming in, but we can domestically produce cars. It's not like we're going to not have cars, it's just we'll produce them domestically. Well, but wait a minute. If before there were a lot of foreign cars coming in when people were engaging in voluntary transactions, well, then that means there was some advantage to that, and that your people domestically could not do the exact same thing. And so it must not be the case that they could produce the exact same type of vehicle with the same attributes as far as your people were concerned that the foreign car producers could make. Because if they did, well then why are your people importing them? Okay, so it's the same principle qualitatively as a country that's importing oil. It's just not as stark or extreme. Okay, let me give you a different argument. Suppose there were a household run by this really eccentric father, and he gathered, he's got some kids and his wife, and he calls them in to have a family meeting, and he says, you know what, I think we need to promote the opportunities for work among the members of our household. That, this economy is not great, I'm not sure you guys are going to be able to go get a job out there, and so from now on I don't want anyone in this household buying anything produced by someone who is not a member of this household. So Jimmy, if you want to go buy a basketball or something, you're not allowed to go to the mall and buy it. Have your sister make it for you. And honey, if you want to make dinner for us tonight, that's great, but don't you dare go down to the grocery store and buy any food. Have Jimmy go get you some tomatoes from the backyard. All right. And I needed new brakes for the car, and I was about to go down to the mechanic down the street, but I'm not going to do that now because I realize I would be selfishly giving employment to outsiders rather than bestowing these opportunities on you guys. And so instead, I'm going to myself just go into the garage and scrounge around and see what I can find on the shelves to do something about my brakes. Okay, so what would be wrong with that? Clearly that would be insane, and that family would probably be dead in 6 months. And so the problem is that there are many things for which outsiders are much better equipped to provide the family than they can do domestically or internally. And it's true, it would provide employment opportunities for the members of that household. In fact, all they would be doing is working. They'd be on the edge of starvation. And they would be busy all the time, either trying to keep their clothes in good order or what have you. Scrounge around and figure out what are we going to eat today, because Dad's not allowing us to get anything from outsiders. So if you see the problem there and you see how that would be ridiculous, just notice when the head of a government says we are going to restrict trade from our people vis-a-vis outsiders, it's the same logic. It's just that the household happens to be much bigger, and so the ramifications aren't as extreme. So part of the way to seeing that is if the President of the United States said, from now on we're completely banning international trade and Americans can only deal with other Americans, and this will provide employment opportunities, promote the growth of domestic industry, blah, 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 people wouldn't the next day be reduced to utter starvation, but it would still be very crippling economically. But partly why it wouldn't be so bad is because there are a lot more Americans to trade with each other. And so for any particular American, it's like his potential trading partners went from 5 billion down to 300 million. So yeah, that's bad, and that cuts off a lot of potential gains from trade, but at least there's still 300 million people, namely other Americans, that he can trade with. Whereas our original hypothetical father, with his crazy rule about no one in this household can trade with anyone outside the household, he's effectively saying to each member of his family, before you went from being able to trade with 5 billion people, now you can only trade with 4 people, or however big the family is. And so that's why quantitatively, whoa, those people are literally going to die soon with that crazy policy.